Welcome back to Inside Europe. We are live in the heart of Strasbourg this week in the European Parliament. And joining me are two MEPs, Sander Lones and Steven Woolfe. Now, one thing which is starting to get a bit of attention is the idea of what's going to happen to the EU budget after Brexit, after the UK contribution ends. So this is about £10.8 billion, so it's a relatively large amount of money, and the problems which are going to arise from that, particularly for the remaining 27 states. Sander, if I start with you, how concerned is the EU over the fact that it's going to lose such a huge financial contribution to the project?
In my opinion, not concerned enough. The UK was and is still a net contributor to the European budget. You mentioned the number, $10 billion. It's clear that the UK doesn't want to pay the bill for Brexit, and I understand it. But we do not want to pay it either. So for us, there's only one option, and that's for the EU to cut back in its expenditure. We need to look for savings and not look for options where we just shift the bills and distribute it amongst the other EU member states. That's for sure for Belgium, for Flanders, the country where I'm from. We're not going to pay this bill. We're not going to contribute more.
And in the future, I suppose the dilemma will be, well, with the loss of this contribution, you either have to raise the contributions of all the other remaining states or cut back. You're suggesting then that a cutback would be the more likely option for the EU in terms of
I fear it's not the more likely option, but it is the real and only option. If we want to set the example for all member states who are now having to look for their budget, need to cut back under pressure of the European Union as well, it's time for the Union to set the right example and to cut back too. That's the real and essential option. But I hear different sounds here in the European Parliament. We hear one example after another how the European Union is going to invest more and more and more. We are very strong in setting priorities and never barring priorities of the past. So we're accumulating priorities of the past, of the future, and never looking back at what we should do at the moment.
Steven, do you agree with that? Is it more likely that the EU is going to be cutting back on the project? Because obviously, in terms of those who believe in the European project and want it to, a certain element of expansion, that might be something which is very hard to swallow, the idea of cutting back on the project.
I think cutting back on the project is something they will try to avoid at all costs. And one clear example about that is what I'm hearing from a fellow compatriot of Sanders in terms of the Verhofstadt, is that they're not going to remove the number of UK MEPs, which actually would result in a cost saving to the European Parliament, but either want to distribute it, that's the argument, to other countries, or create a separate class of MEPs at the next election. Now, they should be following Sanders' sensible options of actually cutting the budget of the European Parliament to cover their cost. Everybody should live within their means. But of course, money means power. Power is influence. And that is why they want to keep the budget as high as possible. And the second thing I hear is the demand, or maybe that's an extremist word, but perhaps desire to actually tax the European people through an income tax or a centralised corporation tax.
I mean, you mentioned the cuts. Obviously, the problem then, or the real discussion would be, well, what exactly are you talking about cutting? I mean, in terms of what the EU could do, you mentioned getting rid of or not reallocating the MEPs that the UK had, but otherwise than that, what would be the likely thing to be on the chopping board if they came to it?
It's a beautiful building and it's a fantastic place to come and actually work.
But they can't get rid of Strasbourg, can they? Because they'd have to get France to agree.
Well, they should get rid of Strasbourg in terms of a parliamentary.
But reality, they're not.
No country in the world has 3 parliaments. Belgium in Brussels, Luxembourg and Strasbourg, and that's what the European Parliament has. I think they should go down to 1. It would be a saving, it makes a cost sense, and then they can reallocate resources here if needed.
I mean, there's still £10.8 billion to find. I mean, getting rid of Strasbourg might cut some of it, I suppose, but it's still a huge figure.
It's not enough, but they said the building in Strasbourg is an interesting option. Why? Because we now have a new president in France, Mr. Macron, who puts himself or tries to put himself on the map as Mr. Efficiency, as Mr. Europe. Yeah. So it's now time for the proof of that pudding, and let's eat it. And let's see if Mr. Macron is not only a president of words but also of deeds, and that he can make this happen and cut back on this building here in Strasbourg. But as you mentioned, it will not, in that way, we will not find 10 billion. We'll need to do more. we'll need to cut, but we also need to refocus. If you look at the current European budget, if you look, for example, to security, only 2% of the European budget, 2% of the European budget is invested in security at the times of terror and migration crisis. Only 2%. If you look at investment on migration as well, together they're only 9% of the European budget.
I mean,
and the rest,
is there any areas that you think that could be cut? Do you have areas where you think that really this could be?
For instance, you see that Europe is very strong has a very fruitful cohesion policy, solidarity amongst the north of the European Union and the more southern countries, and you see that that policy is not really coherent. So there's money to be found there, but there's also money to be found in other programs that are typically blocked in this European budget.
I mean, you mentioned President Macron. He's made no qualms about the fact that he's a Europhile. He's looking to bolster and improve European relations and the European Union's functions. He walked in as president to the EU national anthem as opposed to the French national anthem as a sort of symbolic gesture. So, and let's go back to Stephen, back to you. The reality is, it is going to be surely an increase in contributions for countries such as Ireland or other nations in order to pay this 10.8 billion hole.
You have a huge battle that's going to happen between those who want cost efficiency and savings and those who want to expand the European project at all costs. Those who demand the continuation of the project at its current financial levels will only have the option of either taxing the European citizens through increasing VAT or moving, as I've heard, towards an income tax. But certainly, as we already see with the common corporation tax base, the idea that you can have a common tax. Now, that will have a significant impact on Ireland because it will come to a position where it says the EU will tell Ireland that you have to increase corporation tax to the levels that make you the same. They will use the word solidarity. They will use the same European equality. And as a consequence of that, you will put Ireland against the European Union because it's one of the things that saved Ireland's economy pre-EU and actually during the crisis.
And of course, Leo Varadkar, newly installed, has made it clear that he's pro-European, so that perhaps is something that he might be tested on, how far his convictions will go. Just your final thoughts, Sander.
I think Mr. Macron, he can bring a wind of change in the European institutions and European politics. For that, he will need to change France first. If he manages in changing France, then perhaps he can play with a little bit more weight on the European level. But the only thing I see now today, if I hear his example for European taxes, for a separate European budget, for instance, is we all know that reforms in France means strikes. And then the question is, who will pay for these strikes? It's logic that France needs to pay, but I think Mr. Macron hopes that Europe will pay by European budget, by European finances, and that's not how we're going to play that game.
Well, that's another argument for another day. But Sander and Stephen, thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you.